pre-meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission on April 16th, 2020. We've scheduled 45 minutes for this section before we go into the formal meeting at on or about 9:45. So thanks everyone for coming. I want to start by just doing a quick roll call. So I'll first go to the commission and then the ODOT participants. So Vice Chair Simpson, are you on?
I'm here. I am. Good morning.
Commissioner Callery. Good morning. Commissioner Callery. Commissioner Brown.
Here.
Commissioner Smith.
I'm here.
Director Strickler.
I am on, sir.
Thank you. And then I think we have all or nearly all of the assistant directors, so why don't you just identify yourselves.
This is Cooper Brown, the Assistant Director for Operations, Mr. Chair.
Morning, Cooper.
This is
Travis.
This is Travis Brower, Assistant Director for Revenue Finance Compliance.
I think Lindsay was going to try and be on this call. Lindsay, are you on?
Good morning. This is Lindsay. I'm here.
Great. Mr. Director, we also have a new assistant director, so maybe take this opportunity for, I don't know that she's on this call, but well, let's just find out.
Happy to, Mr. Chair. Nikatris, are you on the call by chance?
So maybe when we get to your comments, she on?
This is Lindsay. I was just going to jump in. I was just texting with Nikatris, and she does not have the conference line, the call-in number, so I was just going to forward it to her really quickly because she was planning to be on the phone.
Okay. So we'll, when she gets on, we can, Chris, you can do the honors of introducing her to the group.
Perfect. And I also have a short description of her background and how excited we are to have her in the director's report for the meeting.
Okay, great. So when we get through the rest of the roll call, if she's on by then, I'll turn it to you and then back to me to introduce Karen. Okay, so are there, let's just see, please, others identify yourselves. I know there are a number of people on, and I'm going to forget somebody, so I'll just, have you self-identified yourselves? You just did a minute ago.
This is Jerry Bohart, the Division Administrator for Policy Data and Analysis.
Welcome, Jerry.
Karen, this is Sam. Public Participation Division Administrator.
Karen. Thank you, Jeff.
Good morning. This is Mac Lynn, Deputy Administrator for Delivery and Operations.
Anyone else?
Good morning. Jess McGrath.
Oh, this is Jess. Hi, Jess. That was Karen.
Good morning.
Sorry. Morning, Jess. Morning, Karen.
Morning.
Good morning. This is Eric Hovick, Statewide Policy and Planning Manager.
Morning. Eric, welcome. Anyone else?
Chair, I think I got in there. Sam Ziegler with DOJ.
Morning, Sam. Welcome.
Good morning.
The next item is Karen's report, but I don't want to miss the opportunity for an introduction. Maybe, Karen, when new assistant director is on, we can interrupt your presentation momentarily. Just to,
Mr. Chair, I believe she is on now, so if you don't mind, I'll let Nikatris introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nikatris Perkins. I'm really excited to be serving as the new Assistant Director of Social Equity. I've been in Portland for about 5 days, and so excited to learn and serve well.
Well, welcome. and we're really pleased to have you on board. So look forward to your leadership. Okay, with that, unless there are any other preliminaries, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Criswell for her presentation. Karen?
All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Karen Criswell, Public Transportation Division Administrator. I wanted to bring to you this morning some information about the recently passed Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, which includes public transportation funding to assist providers during the pandemic. The funding may be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19, including operating costs to maintain service, lost revenue, purchase of personal protective equipment and bus and facilities cleaning and disinfecting, and to pay administrative leave salaries for operations personnel. The FTA will be distributing approximately $243 million to large and small urban transit providers in Oregon, which they will do directly with those providers, and another nearly $43 million to rural and inner city transit providers, which ODOT will be responsible for distributing to those providers. So we received notice of our apportionment of those funds on April 2nd, and we are preparing and are prepared to distribute the funds in two ways. So the first is by formula, using a formula process and an allocation method that's similar to our previous FTA 5311 rural formula fund distribution. The funds are 100% federal match. There's no local match requirement. We are going to be making available up to 1 full year of funding using the 1921 formula fund award allocation as the basis, which accounts for roughly 25% of the CARES Act funding. The formula funds would be reimbursable for allowed expenses, and we will be processing those reimbursement requests on a monthly basis rather than our standard quarterly basis, as needed to ensure that financially strained providers are able to remain operational. We published the formula funding guidance and the application forms last week with the goal of having fully executed grant agreements in place by mid-May, which would enable transit providers to nearly immediately submit their first funding reimbursement request. These agreements will be retroactive back to January 20th. Now, the second big chunk of funding, part of why we made the choice to do a portion of it as formula and get the funds out immediately, and a larger portion as sort of a needs-based rolling solicitation. And we are still working on the details of that and hope to have that, plan to have that guidance published in the next couple of days. But the idea here is that as the pandemic continues to unfold, this will give us the flexibility to distribute the funding to the areas of the state where the COVID impacts and the funding needs are the greatest. So, for example, we had some transit providers that nearly immediately after the stay-at-home order was announced and due to their local conditions decided to terminate services. Most others have been able to remain operational, albeit in a very modified basis to keep services going, to get people to the doctor, to get essential workers to their jobs. So our hope is that this will allow us to be responsive and flexible and kind of serving and meeting immediate needs as well as trying to meet needs as it continues to evolve. So that is, I think, a pretty high-level summary of our plans and the rationale for why we're choosing to do this as we are. It's very different from any process that we've done before, but this pandemic is also very different, and it, I think, has required some creativity on our parts to both be responsive in a very fast fashion, as well as thoughtful and flexible over the longer term. Happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thanks, Karen, very much. So, questions from the commission, if any?
This is Martin.
Yes,
I'm
Martin.
wondering, have any of these rural providers lost personnel that they can't replace at this point, or do you have that data?
Yes, we collect data on a weekly basis from our transit providers to supply a report to FTA. As far as we are aware of, there have been no deaths within any of the transit providers organizations to date in Oregon. Other states have not been as fortunate. So we definitely have had some transit providers who have experienced some illnesses here in Salem area Mass Transit had quite a large number of positive cases, which they shut down temporarily for a while, and were able to do some deep cleaning, get some systems in place, and were able to resume a modified service a week later. So our providers are, I can't tell you the incredible work our providers are doing to not only try to keep their employees safe, but to also try to get the traveling public essential workers to the locations where they need to be. It's an incredible time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That was
Commissioner
way
Cowdery,
more
for your
than
question. Thank you, Karen,
But I
and
was
thank you,
compelled
Commissioner
to
Cowdery.
share.
Other questions? And please identify yourself before you speak, actually through the entire day, so we have the public knowing who's talking. Are there any other questions for Karen? Okay, thank you. So next we'll turn to the director for a brief report on the COVID virus as it relates to the work of the department. So, Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As requested, Chris Strickler, Director ODOT. I wanted to give just a quick update, and thank you for the time. So, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission, I need to start by saying just how proud I am of the agency and the things that everybody are doing to step into this space that is just a different reality from what I think any of them signed up for as they come into the transportation world. This is quite a different response and quite a different effect, not just on our people, but on the public. And how we enter into that space and our teams is really important, and I'm just so proud of the work that they're all doing. I want to also then reference that when we think about COVID-19 and the stay-home order and how that's affecting the agency, I want to remind us that we have some services that are not going forward. And some of those services really are some of those customer service interface elements. So think of DMV and a few of those others that really have that customer service counter interaction. And our crews are working really effectively at building plans to say, what does it mean when we come out of that stay-home order, or as we incrementally roll out plans to open up. We have no time frame in order at this point. We're still reacting to the health emergency clearly, but we are thinking about that because we know how important it is to get those services back online. I'd also then say that a significant number of the services are available in online format, and so they're available to the public in that way. The other thing that I want to say is that, and I mentioned this before, but our contracting community, consulting community, et cetera, have really been stepping up. And when it comes to our project-related activity and things out there on our facilities and out there in the world, we're still moving many of those elements, if not a significant number of those elements forward. Contractors have really stepped up. The consultant teams have stepped up. They are keeping the economy moving. And even so much as looking to the Rose Quarter project, while I anticipated the CMGC contract or request for proposals to go out probably a few months after the decision made by the Commission in early April, that contract actually went out, or excuse me, not the contract, but the request for proposals went out on Monday. So a significant amount of work still going on in doing our part to try and keep people moving to the extent that they need to in those emergent environments. I'd also say that the virus is going to be with us for a while. We know that this pandemic has lasting effects, and so normal is going to look very different when we come out the other side. But I'm really, like I said, proud of the work that the entire team has put into really reacting and stepping into that place where we recognize that it's important for government to open first. And again, we are predominantly open, but for those services that are not, we are recognizing the importance of getting those online, and we are working closely with our partner agencies as well. Mr. Chair, that is my update.
Thank you, Mr. Director. I wanted to ask a couple of questions myself and then open it up to others. The one question is with respect to those, as you were describing them, kind of front counter customer service kinds of services like DMV office services. We are still providing, people are still working at DMV, and we are still providing online services. So I just wanted maybe you to talk for a few minutes about that, since we have members of the public and this is a public session, so it's a way to get the word out a little bit. So maybe you could give us a couple of examples of where people can't walk in, but they shouldn't think they can't get the service to some extent online.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. What I may do is provide just a few thoughts, and then if Administrator McClellan is on, that he or Assistant Director Brower jump in as well. But a few introductory thoughts. So we still have roughly 6 offices around the state that are working with our commercial drivers. Now, we've seen the number of transactions go down, clearly. But we do want to make sure that we still have access to commercial drivers, so those are still available by appointment and those kinds of things. When we look at our online services, there's a significant number of transaction activity that can occur there, whether that's renewing a vehicle registration or things such as that. Maybe I'll stop there and look to Mr. McClellan or Mr. Brower to jump in and provide just a few more things that we are still providing the service through DMV.
I'm referring to Tom, who's actually on the phone.
Okay, I'm not sure he is.
I will. Yeah, I didn't hear his name necessarily. So yes.
So please identify yourself before
thank you.
you get the habit of. Thank you.
Yeah,
Travis Brower.
This is Travis Brower, the Assistant Director for Revenue, Finance, and Compliance, overseeing the DMV through Tom McClellan, our DMV Administrator. The DMV is still largely open for business, with most of our transactions that people need to process still available. So people can still register a vehicle online or by mail. I know that because I just got my vehicle registration renewal notice yesterday in the mail. You can still do a title transaction. I know that because I just mailed in a title fee the other day. And other transactions such as getting trip permits or driver records are all also available either online or to the mail or other formats that have traditionally been available. The major limitation really is on those Class C non-commercial driver's licenses. We have and identification cards as well. We have about 30,000 of those that expire every month. And despite valiant efforts by the DMV, we were not able to hold to social distancing limits with the number of people in offices very effectively. We're creating a potential hazard issue. So we have limited those transactions to commercial driver's licenses only in those 6 major offices spread across the state. But most DMV transactions can still move forward.
Thank you, Assistant Director. My other question to Director Strickler and or designees who may be on the phone is around the issue of, while we're obviously learning as we go on this, and as you said, Director Strickler, we have it is a whole new world for everyone. There's some speculation that, heaven forbid, we could get through this only to find that we're back in it later in the year. And so I'm wondering, as we're going, are we taking note of ways we can quickly, if necessary, and I sincerely hope it won't be necessary, to be able to shift back to a more virtual environment if we need to, if there's a second wave. So I assume as we're going through this, we're learning how we might pivot back to it if necessary. And again, I hope it's not necessary. So, Director Strickler, would you just comment on that for a second?
You bet. Mr. Chair, Chris Strickler here. We are certainly thinking about what it means to kind of provide some of those services that we either haven't been able to provide or that have gone completely online, and kind of re-engage, especially for those populations that struggle to get online. We've also begun looking at what it actually means to then have an orderly kind of retraction if we get to that point. Now, clearly, nobody wants to get to that point, as you described, Mr. Chair. But in our planning efforts, we're looking at what it means to incrementally open back up some of those service areas where we have kind of those more vulnerable populations that need access from our service. But then also what it would mean to actually kind of go through a bit of that regression period and close or at least provide additional constraint if we need to in something that's a little more orderly and a little less immediate than what we went through in the first shutdown process.
Great, thank you. So questions by members of the Commission or the Director on COVID? Okay, hearing none, Director Strickler, we'll stick with you to take us through the agenda review.
Thank you, sir. Once again, Chris Strickler. In our agenda today, we have somewhat of a short agenda, but it's an important setup for some of the conversations we have ongoing over the next several months. So our opening remarks from the chair, and I've got a few updates myself, and then we'll jump into a conversation with Assistant Director Brower and Brown regarding the McKinsey Management Review and some of our progress made to date there. As we start to think about next steps for the workshop for the Commission, what it means as far as really aligning where we sit between agency and Commission, it's clear that we want to create that space, and you and I have had conversations regarding this, Mr. Chair, where the Commission can really lead us into that next future for the agency and for the Commission. And so as we think about that, we also want to discuss what it means to kind of clean up some of our delegations as it relates to the agency. So what are those things that really belong with the agency so that the Commission can spend their time in the areas where you're leading forward. So that is part of our agenda topic today, both an introduction and then also a request for approval of revised delegation for our STIP program that Deputy Division Administrator Lind will be presenting. And then finally, a consideration of the consent calendar and looking to adjourn by the 11:20 timeframe.
Okay. Are there questions of Director Strickler on the agenda? So I have one thing that I was thinking about yesterday that I'll just raise. This is really for a future meeting, but I do think we need to talk about it relatively soon. And it relates to the Governor's Executive Order 20-04, which is the climate executive order. And I noted that it includes 2 specific directives to the department, which all of you at the department, I'm sure, are aware of. This is at section or paragraph 10 of that executive order. So it's specific directives to all of these. One is in consultation with DEQ and ODOE and other state agencies and public utilities to conduct a statewide transportation electrification infrastructure needs analysis. That study should be completed not later than June 30, 2021. And the other, and I note we have a couple of STIP items today, is that we develop and apply a process for evaluating GHG emission implications of transportation projects as part of the regular capital planning and STIP planning processes. That, too, is a report that we're required, ODOT is required to provide to the governor not later than June 30, 2021. And I know we're not prepared today to talk about this. I'm just bringing this up today. So this is, without prior notice. I just wanted to kind of get this in front of the agency. It's something I think at some point over the summer, we should have some, over this summer, we should have some, either in July or August, we should have some discussion about this, at least initially, since these are 2 new directives that are specific to ODOT and that we're on point on. And I'd just like to talk about what people's thinking is on that process, those 2 processes, the electrification and the GHG emissions directives. And we've been giving kind of an outside date. And I'm just curious about what kind of timeline we're going to be working under there. Again, not for today. We're not. This order just came out recently, but I do want to get this in front of the commission as 2 directives that we are that we're being asked by the governor to pursue, and to get some at least initial briefing on it. So I guess I've just mentioned those, Director Strickler, and any comment you've got on it at this point. Again, I know I'm just going to bring this up out of without any prior discussion about it, so I don't expect a lot of substance today, but I do want to get it on the list of things we should be looking at and beginning to understand. So an initial briefing would be helpful, I believe, to the commission, so we can keep track of these 2 things.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Chris Strickler here. I completely agree. And I think one of the things that as we look to not just the commission workshop, but then ongoing information and providing updates, what's clear is that as an agency, we're evolving, and that's an adaptation to, I think, priorities that have come to us from multiple sources. So rather than name them, I'll just say there's a universe out there that's kind of defining what transportation in the future should look like. But then also how we are reacting to that. And so whether it's updates regarding advancements in urban mobility, a recent reorganizational change that the commission endorsed and led, or continued updates regarding the executive order, or even the STS implementation efforts, and as those come together under our climate office with Amanda Peets. It seems as though we have those standing briefing items that really make sense for us to have really populate either all or almost all of our commission agendas, so that we can kind of have a cadence where we're providing those updates on a regular basis. And that's one of those efforts that we wanted to talk about going into the workshop discussion over the summer months, so that we can really refine the agenda format in a way that really works well for the commission and provide those updates. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying I think that's a great idea, and I think we stand ready to provide those updates on an ongoing basis well in advance of the due dates.
I agree with that. I think that one of and I agree, we need the workshop to really sit someplace and really talk through these things in a holistic and fulsome way, so we're getting everyone's viewpoint heard, and we're planning our work accordingly. But I completely agree with you that about the notion of standing items, and we're getting regular reports on. We need to figure out as a commission what those should be, and as an agency, kind of a joint conversation between the commission and the agency, so that we can track the things we really, as a commission, need to be on top of, and also be doing it in a way that's transparent to the agency and to the public, so we're all on the same page. And I think the executive order, there might be I have to think through this about, as you've described, as we're evolving into an agency that's responding to a broader range of needs and challenges, we're going to need to organize our work somewhat differently than in the past to make sure we're being responsive in all these places, some of which are not new, some of which I would just say had three categories, one of which predate House Bill 2017, the second of which is the period since House Bill 2017, and then kind of emerging issues that are even more recent, that may be coming out of executive orders or from other actions at various levels of government. A good example would be of something we don't have today. Well, a good example would be COVID, but maybe another example would be something like a federal infrastructure initiative, where suddenly we would need to be talking regularly about what's going on in light of some action by Congress and the White House on infrastructure. So I do think, and that's why we want to do this workshop in a thoughtful way, so we're getting maximum conversation around what the work plan is and how it's evolving, and it clearly is evolving. So appreciate that response, Director, and apologize for not noting it to you prior to the meeting, but I'm sure you all know about it, so it wasn't a complete surprise. Okay, those were my questions. Are there questions from other members of the commission to the Director on the agenda? Okay. Hearing none, since we have set the business meeting to begin at 9:45, we may have members of the public who will not be dialing into or tuning in to the meeting until that time. So I was thinking we should probably take a 10-minute break and come back at 9:45 so that we're beginning at the meeting at the time that we noticed everyone that we are going to start the meeting. I think that's the right decision. I don't want to start early and have people miss something that they might have wanted to have heard. Director, what's your thought on that?
I agree completely, sir.
Members of the commission, any objection to that?
That makes sense to me.
Okay, so since we noticed for a 9:45 start, we're going to take a 10-minute break. But we will be back, a 9-minute break. So we will be back promptly at 9:45 to begin the business meeting. So we're in recess for 9 minutes.
sir.
Great. And I think the first agenda item after your report is will be a presentation by Assistant Directors Brower and Brown. So Travis and Cooper, are you on?
This is Travis. I am indeed.
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is Cooper.
Thank you, gentlemen. So this is Bob Van Brocklin. I'm Chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission. I'd like to call, it's 9:45 a.m. Pacific, and I'd like to call our April 16th meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission to order. And I want to begin by ensuring that all of the members of the commission are on. So I'll just quickly run through the commission and get a roll call present here. So Vice Chair Simpson.
I am here.
Thank you. Commissioner Callery.
I'm here.
Morning. Commissioner Brown.
I'm here.
Good morning. And Commissioner Smith.
I am here as well. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Well, thank you. And I just mentioned Director Strickler is, ODOT Director Strickler is on, and Assistant Directors Travis Brower and Cooper Brown are on, and then as we go forward from here, we'll be introducing other speakers throughout our meeting. So I would encourage everyone to introduce yourself before you speak and every time before you speak, so that those that are participating remotely are able to hear not only what we're saying, but who's saying it. So with that, I will segue into a couple of remarks of my own and then turn it over to Director Strickler, and I'll be brief in my comments. So really, they fall into two categories today. The first is I just want to acknowledge, of course, the coronavirus, which is a pandemic that, of course, is reaching worldwide and having tremendous impact on the entire world. I want to focus in my comments, however, on Oregon, and begin by thanking Governor Brown and Oregon state and local government in cooperation with federal government working so diligently and tirelessly on our behalf to ensure that Oregon is responding in a effective manner to a virus that we've never faced before and is a highly contagious and devastating virus that has caused has caused death to tens of thousands of people in our own country and even more throughout the world, and of course many who thankfully are surviving it or are getting through it, various levels of treatment and concern, but the majority of whom are surviving it. Obviously, huge impacts in the state to a whole range of services and to a number of people. Thankfully, we have had a lower number of cases here in Oregon than in many other states. I think the last numbers I saw were about 1,600 cases and something around 50 deaths. It's maybe a little bit more now. So that is, of course, terrible news, but it could have been far worse had our government leaders not done what they've done, led by the governor and the legislature and mayors and county commissioners and others all over the state. So I thank them. Obviously, thank the Oregon healthcare community, the public safety community, and essential service providers, whether they be grocers or drugstores, pharmacies, who are helping us get through this. And we will get through it together. So the other thing I wanted to mention is this is clearly having effect on ODOT, and is having, which the director can speak to in a minute. It's also having effect on the commission itself. We're used to seeing one another and meeting in person relatively often. We've not been able to do that since this has happened, and we're under the same executive order everyone else is under with respect to physical and social distancing, and with respect to the meeting in groups. And so we are necessarily having to meet in the way we're meeting today, which is by phone. That is not our preference. And we look forward to getting to the other side of this. In terms of public comment in that forum, this kind of environment we're in, we're unfortunately not able to take public comment in person, oral comment, and so we're relying more heavily on written comment. We are encouraging written comment, and we have opened comment periods before each meeting and leading up to each meeting in order to have public comment on items that are in front of us, and we receive those comments ahead of the meeting and we review them. So we appreciate everyone who has commented in our meetings of this kind. We think public participation is very important. We value it highly, and just unfortunately we can't take in-person public comment at this time as we traditionally have. So I would encourage people to continue to participate. I would encourage people to continue to provide comment to us, although it will be in writing in the short term. And I want to thank everyone who has submitted comments today, and we have reviewed them and we appreciate them. Whether it be those of you who commented on the Rose Quarter decision that we made at the last meeting, or have commented on MPO planning funding, as Mr. Bob Courtwright did in a letter he sent to us, or on our intermodal projects, including the Treasure Valley Reload Center, as Mr. Michael Walker did. We are reading what you are writing to us, and we are paying attention to it. Again, continue to participate, and we appreciate your commenting. So with that, I'll close, and unless there is anything any member of the commission wants to add on either of those topics or some other topic they want to make sure are surfaced at this point in the meeting, I'll stop here and see. Okay, then I'm going to turn it over to Director Strickler for his report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, Chris Strickler, Oregon Department of Transportation Director, privileged to serve in that capacity. I have 4 quick updates, but important ones that I'm proud to share this morning. First is a follow-on from some of the Chair's remarks. As the Chair mentioned, the Governor's Executive Order 20-12 really presented the challenge to us to find ways to host events more virtual or in a virtual setting, and find ways to keep government working and keep some of the activities going that we can. Thankfully, we have a commission and we have a team of professionals that have some experience with doing this, and we have a history and a past of conducting at least some of our meetings virtually. And so our work is continuing with some modifications, of course. But it does present the question and the note that the Chair brought up, which is just how we receive public comment. For now, we've been receiving public comment in writing for the last few meetings, and we want to continue that process so that we provide that opportunity. Receiving public comment is of significant importance, not just for the commission and how they conduct their business, but for the agency to hear from those that we serve. We're really trying to find ways to listen and provide comment experience so that we can have that two-way dialogue with those that have the time and interest to do that with us. As an agency, we are researching different tools that we can put in place during these times that we're in right now that may allow for real-time public testimony. And while we can't commit to that at this point right now, we are actively searching for those because it is so important to us as an agency. So I wanted to flag that for you and just send my appreciation for the public and for the Commission's continued engagement and patience as we're evolving. I will tell you that I'm extremely thankful, again, like I said, that we have experience and we have in the past conducted some of these meetings virtually already. And so that experience has allowed us to continue in this way, at least so far. And I think that's been good, not just for the agency, but for the service we provide to the public. So I'm happy about that. The second topic is I want to recognize our new Assistant Director for Social Equity, Nikachis Perkins. So you'll recall in December of 2019, the Commission approved the establishment of 4 Assistant Director positions. The purpose of those positions was to increase the bandwidth for our agency leaders and better prioritize our activities, strategize for our future, align with the efforts of the Commission, and deliver for the public. I'm excited to say that after a nationwide recruitment effort, we have the honor of having Nikachis Perkins accepting the position of Assistant Director for Social Equity, and she will lead our efforts as we look to institutionalize equity, diversity, and inclusion into ODOT's programs, policies, performance, and priorities. She'll lead efforts that will place an equity lens on transportation decisions within communities and in the funding decisions that we make as an agency and that we take to the Commission for consideration. Developing equity and inclusion is a vital workforce skill, and we want to ensure that it happens within the walls of ODOT, but then also with our contractors, consultants, and advisory structures. We want to make sure that equity is reflected in all the work that we do. Ms. Perkins comes to us from a research firm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she has served as a senior strategist, and she has worked that has included transforming organizational culture and beliefs, especially as it relates to inclusion, race, and equity. She has coached business owners, consultants, and startups on how to talk about race with an emphasis on valuing voice and providing consultation to youth and educational institutions on implementation of equity and inclusion strategies. She has spent her career finding ways to engage people in ways that assist them in meeting their goals and dreams while strengthening the impact of sustainability of organizations. We are really excited to welcome Ms. Nikachis Perkins and help us move with intention towards the new chapter of the agency's direction and progress. The next topic is recognition for the appointment of the new Delivery and Operations Division Administrator, Karen Rowe. So I'm excited to announce the appointment of Ms. Rowe as the department's Administrator for Delivery and Operations, which was formerly known as the Highway Division. She is a professional engineer, a graduate of California Polytechnic University. She started her career working in California on big transportation projects, working in various parts of the state at the Colorado Department of Transportation, and most recently served for over 5 years as their Southeast Region Transportation Director. She'll bring over 25 years of transportation and engineering, design, construction, programming, and planning experience to ODOT. She's a talented leader and a proven leader in her field. She has the right experience and ability to ensure that our largest and most complex issues that we deal with on a project basis will continue to deliver while evolving to meet those demands of the future. And while she is not here on the call today, she will be starting on April 20th, so in the very near term. And I just want to say for both Ms. Perkins and Ms. Rowe, I want to acknowledge the fact that we're in the midst of this COVID experience and we're in the midst of things being quite different, and both of them come from locations across the country. And I applaud them for diving in and both not only being willing but accepting ODOT as their new home and doing that especially during this time of need and this time of interesting work environment. We do want to find ways to embrace them, bring them into the fold of ODOT and allow them to leave their footprint and their fingerprints on how we conduct our business, and we're excited about that. And so I'd ask just those that are on the commission and those that are within the agency, reach out, introduce yourself, especially in this telephonic time. We're excited to have both of them on board. The last topic is really just a testament to the work that our crews do. And I mentioned at the last commission meeting that we experienced an earthquake in eastern Oregon and in Idaho on March 31st around 5 p.m. What's important to note is that we were in the midst of the COVID experience. We were in the midst of the pandemic, and yet our crews for Region 5 and Region 4 provided support to the Idaho DOT after that 6.5 magnitude earthquake. So this is a true testament to our crews showing up and conducting the business of the people and continuing to move forward even in these times. During that time, the crews established and conducted their inspection activities with the appropriate social distancing, maintaining 6 feet of distance at all times, keeping their vehicles, equipment, and tools disinfected and wiped down. And we are very fortunate that those crews were willing to step into that space and go inspect all of our critical infrastructure and find that we did not incur any significant damage. I would say that we are lucky on two fronts. One, for a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, not giving significant damage to the system, but just as importantly, for our crews' ability to respond, and congratulations goes out to Region 4 and Region 5 crews for responding to that event, especially in the midst of this pandemic. So, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, that is my report for today.
Thank you, Director Strickler, very much. Good report. I want to, just on behalf of the entire Commission, welcome Ms. Rowe and Ms. Perkins to Oregon, to the agency, and to our meeting today. I know that at least Ms. Perkins is participating and listening. So welcome. We're delighted you're here, and we look forward to working with you. So with that, I am going to turn to our 10:05 agenda item, which is McKinsey Management Review, and to Assistant Directors Travis Brower and Cooper Brown to walk us through that.
Well, thank you, Chair Van Broecklyn and members of the Commission. This is Travis Brower. I'm the Assistant Director for Revenue, Finance, and Compliance. And Cooper and I are going to be splitting up this presentation today, talking about the ODOT Management Review. I am going to take the first portion, really giving the historical context, which will be review for some of you, but for some of you who have joined the Commission after the Management Review work was launched, there may be some new content there as well. Mr. Brown will take us then and talk really about the next steps and what we see going into the future. So we can go to slide 2, actually, and I will begin talking through the various phases of the Management Review. For context, Governor Brown called for a review of ODOT's management and operations back in the late fall of 2015. McKinsey and Company was engaged to undertake that review in the fall of 2016 and began that work. They were able to deliver their report by March of 2017. And then DAS, which ran the review to ensure impartiality, and it was a third-party independent review, was able to put together recommendations that went to the Commission in March as well. So we have used those recommendations as the basis for much of our work in implementing the Management Review that gave us a roadmap forward. Subsequent to those recommendations came in, HB 2017 passed, and that both furthered some of the efforts that were called out in the Management Review by actually doing some of the things that were recommended by McKinsey, but also added some new wrinkles, including changing some of the OTC statutory authorities and creating the CIAC. So we adapted on the fly. The phase 2 of this, which took place really from passage of HB 2017 until last year, was implementation of the DAS recommendations. And though we're not completely done with all of that, we have largely completed the initial work under the DAS recommendations. Through that process, we made regular reports to the Commission, including monthly progress updates, and it was the OTC that provided direction and accepted most of the deliverables for this work. Phase 3 is what we've entered now, which is really the follow-up on the management review, going back and looking at whether we've accomplished that, and then making sure we're institutionalizing continuous improvement throughout the agency, not just in those areas where the management review specifically called for things. We can move to the next slide, to slide 3, please. So as I noted, we immediately launched in and worked through all of DAS's findings. I'm going to spend a decent amount of time today speaking about the role of the OTC, which was the first finding and recommendation that DAS directed. McKinsey's review found deficiencies in 3 areas related to the Commission's roles. First was strategy. There was a strategic misalignment within the Commission members and between the ODOT and the OTC, where not everyone shared the same goals or were able to articulate those goals in direction that we were all supposed to be pulling in. The second was in governance, where the OTC's roles, responsibilities, and decision-making were somewhat ambiguous and inconsistent. This was in part due to some of the statutory constructs that were written down, and to a significant degree, HB 2017 attempted to rectify this. The third area was in the area of performance, where McKinsey called out that OTC was not involved in setting performance measures and targets for the agency or holding the agency accountable to meeting those. So HB 2017, as I noted, made some changes in some of those things, but after passage of that bill, where it modified statutory direction to OTC, it strengthened OTC's role in decision-making. And so the Commission and ODOT worked together through a series of governance workshops and took numerous concrete steps to try to address those deficiencies that were noted. That included creating bylaws for the Commission, updating the delegation order of the department, developing a work plan for the Commission, updating key performance measures, creating a quarterly performance report, creating new staff, including the OTC Chief of Staff role, standing up the CIAC, the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee, that is, and a number of other steps. But I wanted to really flag this because nearly 3 years into this work and with almost complete turnover of the Commission during that time, it feels like it's really time to assess whether we have addressed those deficiencies that McKinsey identified in the areas of strategy, governance, and performance, and what other steps we may need to take in that iterative and continuous process of improving the Commission's governance of the agency. So that was really the first issue that we wanted to flag and the first recommendation that came out of the DAS work. There were also a number of other areas that I'll touch on just very briefly that the Commission oversaw. So the first was creation of a strategic business plan to really drive the agency's direction, improve our organizational health so we can better achieve our mission. There were also 2 rounds of adjusting our key performance measures to better align with our goals and our statutory mandates, and reporting to the Commission on performance. So the Commission now has a statutory role in both setting the key performance measures and holding the agency accountable for that through a regular annual report. One of the other areas that DAS recommended was creating a plan around how we would communicate with the public, particularly around how to engage with the decision-making process and looping back on the outcomes of those decisions. So we put together that transparency and decision-making plan and then really worked hard to apply that to the development of the 21 through 24 SIP that the Commission is going to receive and approve in July. The DAS recommendations also include a number of areas around efficiency and improvement efforts on fleet, facilities, and procurement. And so we have dived into those and been taking significant steps there in working through how we can better become a more efficient department and make sure we're spending our resources wisely through strategic investments in those areas. And I would note that, particularly with the standing up Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee, we work to engage the CIAC in a number of these, particularly those improvement and efficiency efforts, as well as the key performance measures, as they have statutory direction in both of those areas. So I would note, though, that there were certainly times where we may have focused more on the trees than on the forest, where we focused in on specific elements in what DAS directed us to do and may have missed the bigger picture. So what we wanted to do today is really loop back with the Commission and get your feedback on where did we succeed in addressing the issues that were raised in the McKinsey review and that were directed by DAS, and where might there be some additional work to do. And so I will turn it over to Cooper, who will talk you through what we see as some of the next steps and the opportunities for institutionalizing continuous improvement in the agency.
Thank you, Travis. Good morning, Chair, Commissioners. This is Cooper Brown, the Assistant Director for Operations for ODOT. I will pick up where Travis left off, and if we can please go to slide 4, I believe, that has the next chapters on it. Thank you, Michelle. So as Travis mentioned, turning now to, he gave a great history of where we've been in meeting the recommendations that came out of DAS, which were informed by the McKinsey report. As mentioned, we're really looking at the continuous improvement of how we do our business as chapters. So we had that initial chapter that was the McKinsey report and the DAS recommendations. We had the subsequent chapter, which was House Bill 17, which addressed some of those issues, and then now we have really the implementation of continuing implementation of the DAS recommendations, obviously implementing House Bill 17, and really looking to what is the next chapter to, as Travis described it, institutionalizing a culture of continuous improvement in the department. As mentioned, there's been a great deal of work around refining and defining the roles and responsibilities and authorities of the Commission and the department over the last few years. This also feeds into a little bit the next agenda item, which we'll discuss, but there is a recognition that given the commissioners who are on the Commission now, who weren't privy to some of these conversations in the past, and given the changes that have been made both in terms of the organization and also just the landscapes that ODOT is operating in, and direction from the governor and legislature and others, we do want to make sure we revisit how we're delegating responsibilities, roles and responsibilities to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the Commission and the needs of other important stakeholders, obviously like the governor, the legislature, and not least of whom the public that we all serve. So that's an ongoing conversation we'd like to have with you all. I will say another piece of it, to my mind, is the establishment, a really important piece is the establishment of the Continuous Improvement Advisory Committee. In some ways, in 2015, McKinsey came in to do that review of how we do our business. I think we as leaders across the department are looking at, and I think the legislature intended it to be this way, but we're looking at the CIAC is really that standing body that will help us continue to improve and gain efficiencies where needed. And so that's a point worth reiterating is that's a really important body that we need to make sure we're leveraging as best we can. We have ongoing work, if you look to the next bullet, internally that we're excited to bring before you. I believe we'll start this conversation at the May OTC meeting to bring before you what the leaders of the department have been working on over the past few months is really a refinement of our agency priorities, goals, and measures to better align with that shifting reality, as I mentioned, about just where we are as a state and where we're driving. And I'm thinking here of the importance of climate, and as noted previously in this meeting, the establishment of the Climate Office, the Urban Mobility Office, make sure that we're driving in alignment with you all. And so that's the ongoing work that is relevant and was noted as needed in the previous recommendations coming out of DAS. So look forward to continuing that conversation with you and see it as iterative. Meanwhile, there have been great strides, as Travis mentioned, on a number of fronts of the 8 recommendations that DAS made within the department to become more efficient. So I call out procurement and project delivery as 2. On the procurement front, there's been a number of strides that have improved our processes. Guidance for emergency contracts, there's been improved contract administration, policies, improved and reviews of how we do legal sufficiency reviews for our contracts, succession planning, just a number of activities that have taken place within that procurement realm. That said, there's still need and there's still work to be done. In particular, the A&E contracting, architectural and engineering contracting, there is some concern that those are taking too long. And so there's ongoing efforts through the agency performance and strategy team, which I would note is also an element of the department which was added really based on the findings of McKinsey and the DAS recommendations. But they're helping with our really solid procurement team to address some of these challenges. And I would mention that CIAC has taken procurement as an area that they're looking at and will continue to look at and refine and make sure that we're driving in the direction we all want to go there. So more work's being done on that front, I guess, is the bottom line. The same can be said for project delivery. And as you all know, as was evidenced by our cost to complete report and the conversations around the Rose Quarter, there is some improvement that we need to do on cost estimating and other aspects of project delivery. That said, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that since McKinsey and the DAS recommendations, the department has made great strides and improved the processes, and there have been tremendous efforts on this front as well, similar to procurement. So I think we're certainly moving in the right direction and have made a lot of progress. But that said, there are elements that will need to continually be reviewed and continue to be focused on. So all that said, if you will please, Michelle, go to the final slide, slide 5. The questions before the commission today that we'd like to pose, first and foremost, of those 8 recommendations that Travis mentioned that DAS made, we feel that we've addressed most of those, although, as Travis mentioned, there are elements, like I just went over with procurement and project delivery and others, where we will continue to dive. But the 8th request of DAS, or recommendation rather, was that we reassess, we being the commission, or you as the commission and the department, whether we need a follow-on formal management review. And I believe it was directed that in the spring of 2020 we addressed this question. So that's what prompted us to bring this item before you today. And I will tell you, we've had conversations around the agency leadership board table, also around the CIAC around this question. I think that there was some recognition at both of those tables that first and foremost, we don't want to look at our continuous improvement as checking boxes, as addressing recommendations that DAS or McKinsey made and feeling like we can wash our hands and they'll be done. What we're looking at here and what we're driving towards is a cultural shift that really has continuous improvement as a core function of the department, something that we constantly strive to do and recognize that it is ongoing work and never ends. Back to my point about why it's so important to have a body like the CIAC helping us on this front. So the other factor that I would flag is we also recognize that there have been, as you all recognize as well, tremendous changes in the department in terms of both leadership. Obviously, Director Strickler stepping into his role after Mr. Director Garrett's very long tenure with the department. The establishment of assistant director positions, the establishment of some new offices, as mentioned, the Urban Mobility Office, the Climate Office. So there's a lot of change going on. We're also obviously in the midst of responding to the COVID pandemic, and that's affecting how we do our business. So we're keeping all of those things in mind in terms of when and if we do a formal management review. I think the kind of soft recommendation and thinking on our part is we want to be really mindful of both doing a review because we think that having continual cycles of reviews is probably healthy for the department to assess how we're doing, but also just be mindful of when we do that to ensure that it's not that the data that we get, I guess you could say, isn't skewed, and that it's actually a true reflection of the impacts of structural changes, the impacts of intentional decisions, and not just a capture of the inevitable flux of transition, which we're in the moment of. So I would flag that for you. So the questions really before you are, do you think that we need to do a formal management review at the moment? And of course, we will take your direction. Or is your thinking maybe we revisit this as things evolve? And then the second question, very related, and as Travis already posed, both within the McKinsey findings and the DAS recommendations, and also beyond that, are there issue areas where you think we need to do deeper dives using whatever resources we have available to us, whether that's externally or internally? Like mentioned, we have those ongoing with procurement and project delivery, but are there other areas that you would like us to bring back to you and delve more deeply into as we continue to do this work and as we continue to instill this culture of continuous improvement in the department, which I think is ongoing, but we certainly made great strides towards. So with that, I will pause and welcome feedback, Mr. Chair or Commissioners, on any of these questions or anything else top of mind.
Cooper, this is Orlando, and thank you and Travis for the update in this presentation. I'm curious, when you're saying the formal follow-up management review, are you asking whether or not if we should revisit it from an internal standpoint, or I'm trying to understand what specifically you mean by that question.
Sure. Thank you, Vice Chair Simpson. Yes. So would you like us to do a formal management review? That was a question that was posed by DAS back in their recommendations, is they wanted us to answer that question. So that's, I guess, the hard ask. Do we need to do a formal management follow-up review right now? The second question is, short of that, what are the issue areas that we need to be delving into internally through other means beyond a formal McKinsey-like management review? Does that make sense, Vice Chair?
Yeah, it does, but and I could just be jumping the gun on everybody else, but I still feel like, as Travis had indicated at the beginning, with all the turnover that we've had on the commission ever since this had came out back with HB 17, I'm almost wondering if it's necessary for us to dive into this after we've had a workshop as a commission, as a team, as a unit. Now, obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a transition period as well. Not entirely happy about, but I understand Commissioner Callery. But we also have to take into account to that piece as well, as because I definitely do feel like Martin has a wealth of knowledge and expertise and value set and principles that I think we should be incorporating into our workshop. And I don't know how that timing is going to play itself out, but I feel like the first step is getting everybody, the commissioners, together, talking about just visioning and work plan items and goals for the future, and then from there we start looking at what are the more management prescriptives and things that we'd want to dive into deeper from our new executive team and kind of go down that road. I didn't know if there was like a schedule planned, or if there was some kind of tentative thought process of how we would kind of get into this, but I'm curious to hear about all that as well, given some upcoming changes that we'll be unfortunately enduring as well.
So maybe I could jump in here for a second. So on the question of whether we should have a follow-up management review, I guess my view on that, sorry, I just had a cord come loose. So in terms of the question of whether we should have a follow-up management review, here's my perspective on it. I think we should, but I think the more important question is when. And I think it's premature to have it immediately. So I would I'd kind of offer up these thoughts on why. One of the things that came out of House Bill 2017 was that the Transportation Commission, rather than the governor, would appoint the director. And I led that surge last year, and it took almost a year to do. We started in February and we finished in November at the Senate confirmation hearing, and I think Chris's first day was late November. And that was a pretty heavy lift. There was a lot to do there. We hired a national consultant. We held over 100 conversations in the state around what kind of director, et cetera. We had a list of semi-finalists and finalists from all over the country, and we selected Chris. That then led to Chris, and I talked with him a lot about this, looking at his thinking on leadership within the agency, how the agency ought to be structured, what his leadership team ought to look like. And he proceeded to put in front of us a plan, organizational plan last fall, which we approved. And just this very day, today, we were introduced to the fourth of our, not fourth in ranking, but just the last of the four positions has now been filled with Ms. Perkins, and we now have, as of today, or as of this week, I guess 5 days ago, we finally filled out our assistant director roster. We have created, as others have mentioned, including Assistant Director Brown, we've created a mega project office. We have a new tolling manager. We have a new climate office. We have a lot of change that's been going on. We've hired, we've advanced internally, and we've hired from external places a number of new people who are managing and directing operations who weren't with us a few months ago. So the reason I think it's premature is we took last year to hire a director. We then approved, and Director Strickler has been very, I think, focused and efficient in filling out the new positions that were created and restructuring the department's leadership. And we have had no time to have any experience of length under either the director or the new organizational model. And I think until we do, plus we haven't yet, because of COVID, had a chance to have our workshop and set goals and objectives going forward in a strategic work plan. Until we have more experience with our existing leadership group, which is just being put in place under our new director, and until we have our workshop and have time to talk about our goals and objectives, I just think it's premature to have a management review. It seems to me like we need to give this management team some time to implement a plan that we need to develop in terms of our future direction. And in that respect, just quickly segueing to what's missing for me, or what's next, we go to a slide that talks about next chapter, defining agency priorities, goals, and measures, which is the middle bullet, to me, is the next work to be done. And we've been trying to get there We've been interrupted, as has the world, by this virus. We need to have that session. Then I think we need to let this team, after we've made those decisions and have in place our strategic vision and priorities going forward and our primary objectives, we then, I think, the commission and the agency working collectively need to spend some time trying to implement before we have a management review. So I think we need one at some point. I don't think it's 2020. It might be 2021, maybe second half of the year after we've gotten through the legislative session and also gotten the input of the advantage of hearing from the legislative body about direction, that then it might make sense, or maybe during the session. But I don't think it's time yet. And I think it's hard to pinpoint time until we've done the strategic work and the workshop, and until we've given this team a chance to implement things that are already in place, like tolling, like the mega projects. Like we need to get this new group of leaders, give them an opportunity to work with the existing mandates that are in statute, where they've been set by the commission. So those are my thoughts. Other members of the commission like to weigh in on this question?
Yes, this is Martin. Despite the unfortunate situation we have with COVID-19, I think this offers another opportunity to delay the management review until such time as we get through this, because from a perspective of operations, how we have handled the COVID situation within the agency, I think, is key to part of the management function in the future. I'm hoping that there's never another COVID-type event, but ODOT as an agency has responded well, and I think that has to play into the management review.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mr. Brown?
This is Sharon Smith. Sharon here. I agree with you, Mr. Chair, that having a management review is important, but that now is not the best time to do that. And I agree with your thoughts about doing it after our new leadership team has an opportunity to implement their vision, and we have an opportunity to align our vision and the department's vision, and so I think it's important that we do it, but I think it's more important when we do it, and that we should do it once we've had a little time for the management to do their work, and then also include in the review how we handle the COVID emergency. As Martin pointed out, we hope we don't have another one, but we are going to have other emergencies. And so kind of a general review of how we react to the emergency and what other emergencies, we might have in the future, I think would be a really important element of that review. So I think it's not the right time, but it will need to happen.
Yeah, I think those are, both of your comments and Commissioner Calloway's are very thoughtful, and I agree with you on there will be something else. Obviously, the obvious one we've been talking about is Cascadia, but it could be something else. And so I think I agree with all that thinking on your part and Commissioner Calloway's. I didn't mean to cut you off, Commissioner Smith. Do you have other comments?
No, that's it.
Okay, great. Commissioner Brown, thoughts?
Yes, Chair. I'm in agreement with everything everybody has shared over the last few minutes. I think that it is important that we look at timing, and with a new management team, I think that it gives us an opportunity to really delve deeply into how we're going to address everything. So I do believe we should delay this somewhat, although I want to make sure it stays on the top of our agenda. after the workshop.
So the last thing I would say is I think the next step, again, and I went to this bullet in the middle of the next chapter slide, which is, I think, I don't have the page numbers in front of me, but maybe page 4. At any rate, at the top it says next chapter, continuous improvement opportunities. To me, the next step here is, and I've talked with the director about this several times, and he and I have talked about it, and I think he agrees that the next step for me is alignment and priorities. We need to make sure that we're aligned, Commission and the agency, on a set of objectives, and then I think we need to prioritize them, because if we have 27 objectives in no particular order, I don't think we're done with the work. I think we need to determine what things are strategically important to try and accomplish in the medium and long term, and then we have the operations side, and I think sometimes this is a personal view, my impression is sometimes we have a hard time distinguishing between strategic objectives and operational objectives, and I think the Commission needs to be in the sphere of strategic directions and oversight and policy, and the agency needs to be implementing, moving in that direction. But those directions are prioritization and objectives and strategy, and we need to be in an oversight function in how they're doing with that. And then the agency needs to do operations, a lot of which we don't need to touch. And I think we need to recognize our bandwidth. So I would like to see us have an alignment so we get one set of objectives that we're driving as a Commission and agency, and that we are also working in a way that we're staying with the work we need to do, and allow the Commission to, the department to otherwise be handling the operations. And if we have frustrations with how things are being operated, that we raise them in our oversight function, but that we not try and micromanage. So I think maybe my approach to board work, which this is that you delegate and then you hold people accountable, but you're careful not to get too far into the specifics, because it distracts us from our primary role, which is strategic thinking and policy and oversight. So that's why I think defining priorities and goals and the alignment of the agency and the Commission, as Commissioner Smith was referring to, I think that's the important next step. And then we need to see how we do with that, and then we need to have the management review. And so I don't know exactly when that is. I think we'll have a lot better sense of when we want to do that a year from now or 9 months from now than we have today.
So I guess the original question again is, should we just kind of maybe wait for Travis and Cooper to kind of propose a schedule, given what the Commission has voiced in terms of their suggestions on next steps? Like, I'm just curious about how we anticipate seeing this playing out, because as I'm talking about, we have 5 commissioners. Obviously, Martin's been discussing, his sentiments about his future with the Commission, and so I'm just curious as to how do we engage and make sure that we get Martin's feedback, given the uncertainty of time right now and how things are kind of playing out.
Well, I guess on Martin's departure from the Commission, I think that is not likely to happen. And Martin and I were emailing on this yesterday.
Okay.
His term ends. No, it's a good question, Mr. Vice Chair. Appreciate you raising it. I think his term formally ends at the end of June, we've often had carryover members until their successor is appointed and confirmed. And I suspect that's probably more a fall item than a summer item. And I think Commissioner Cowdery is amenable to staying on for a few more months past his term, the end of his term, official end of the term, June 30. I just think it's more likely to happen in the fall. So I think the step would be have the workshop, hopefully July, let's say, and put this on the agenda as one of the things we talk about. And Assistant Directors Brown and Browser could bring us their view, and if they wanted to sketch out something, I'm happy to work with them and the director to work through what that might look like as a discussion document. But I think we have to be flexible about when that happens in terms of a specific schedule, because I think we're not going to really know specific timing on it until we've had a little bit more experience with the current management team and we've had a chance to set our next stage goals and objectives. So I think it's a good idea to have a discussion about it at the workshop, a further discussion, and then maybe off of that we maybe even look at an initial schedule, and then we just maybe, but we don't act on it until we've got the workshop plan buttoned down. We have a product from the workshop in the form of a new work plan, strategic work plan, that then we can take forward and we can fine-tune the schedule later in the summer. And I agree with your point that we definitely want to have Commissioner Cowdery's participation. After all, he's been, both with respect to his prior background before being on the commission and with respect to the fact that, among other things, he brings a lot of informed perspective in areas that, for example, rail, port operations, that are really important. So I think we want to have him fully involved in all of this over the summer. And I wish I were saying we're almost done with all this because we did it in March, but we couldn't do it in March.
Well, this is Commissioner Cowdery. I have agreed to stay on as needed, given the situation with the legislature and executive appointments. I have no problem with staying on in that position. I also want to point out the fact that this is a unique opportunity as we move forward with strategic planning and the management review to look at the next phase of CIAC, because I think the CIAC has done an excellent job in the initial 2 years that the members have served, but we now have an opportunity to say, okay, do we need to refocus the efforts of CIAC on something such as finance, because we know we're going to be facing some significant revenue questions over the next who knows how long, months, years, and how is that going to affect the ability of ODOT to serve its clients in all modes of transportation. So I just think here's an opportunity to say to the CIAC, let's focus on something else, and finance would be, I think, one of the things I would like to see happen.
Well, some good comments, and I think you're right about the CIAC's role evolving. The good news is right now we have 3 of the 4 people who from the commission have served on the CIAC are on the commission today, and that's myself, Commissioner Smith, and Commissioner Cowdery. The only other member was Commissioner Boehne, then Chair Boehne, and we may want to think about and I haven't talked to her about this idea, but you may want to think about even asking, having Tammy involved somehow if we're going to have a conversation about how the CIAC may evolve. She might be willing to be in on a couple of conversations. I don't know. I haven't talked to her, but knowing Tammy, she probably would. So I agree with all of that. So we don't get too far behind our schedule here, Assistant Directors Brower and Brown, did you get enough from that conversation to kind of provide some initial framework? I think we're all pretty aligned on, we think there ought to be management review at some point, but not now. It's probably off a year or more. And that we ought to be focused as a next step on, in this area, on getting the workshop done, and we can talk about this as part of the workshop. Also talk about the future of the CIAC, at least conceptually, in terms of its work. And I completely agree with Commissioner Cowrie that funding is for me, is on a very short list of priorities and objectives. It might be number one. Did you get enough to feel like this was accomplished? Did you get what you needed?
Commissioner,
the question.
Yes, I believe.
Two of you. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Travis Brower, Assistant Director for Revenue Finance Compliance. Yes, I believe that this has been a great discussion, and we have gotten what we need. We will come back to the Commission as part of that workshop discussion or after that workshop discussion and be able to define what a path forward would be on all those multiple fronts, including defining when, not if, a management review would take place.
Great. Yeah, I think we've answered the question of if, and I think the answer is yes. The when is the issue. And definitely want to do it at the right time. But let's let Assistant Director Perkins, get her bag unpacked before we do one. Okay. There's no more discussion on that. This is listed as a decision point. Did we just give you enough for a decision, or do you need some formal motion? Just want to make sure we're doing this.
So, Mr. Chair, this is...
But you get the product you need.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. This is Cooper Brown, Assistant Director for Operations. I think, as Travis mentioned, we do have enough of what you provided. While it is, it's a bit in a gray area in terms of, I don't think we need a formal decision. We just needed some guidance on direction on this. And the goal was to have the conversation with you all to meet the requirements set forth by DAS to have it around this time frame. But I think the direction you've given is perfectly adequate and no need for a formal vote. I will pause, though, just to make sure if anybody else thinks differently, they have an opportunity to chime in.
It sounds right to me. Okay, well then we're going to turn, keeping Assistant Director Brown in front of us, we're going to turn to the next item, which is item D1, and that is informational discussion on delegations. Assistant Director?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, Cooper Brown, Assistant Director for Operations. Appreciate still having the mic for a little bit. Recognize we're a little bit behind schedule, and I can certainly keep this brief. So the agenda item before you is on OTC delegations and decisions, and really the alignment of these, which is it's a nice segue based on the conversation you all just had about the following up on the McKinsey report and the DAS recommendations. If you can go, please, Michelle, to slide 2. We'll begin there with a little bit of background and history.
on the delegations alignments. And some of this we covered in the previous presentation, so I'll be brief on those points. But as mentioned by Mr. Brower, the McKinsey report and the subsequent House bill both had elements of those clear articulations of how we align roles and responsibilities of the Commission and the Department. And coming out of those were delegation orders, a number of refined processes and rules and other things that got after that. So that's one element of the history of why the delegations that exist now exist in the way they do. The other ones I would flag in terms of the delegations that exist and the items that come before you as a commission are also legacies of a couple other things. One is previous commissioners' desires, commissioners' interest in ensuring that they had close oversight of certain aspects of the department's work, either based on their experience or expertise or preference. And the other is that former leaders, individual leaders within ODOT, have chosen to bring before the Commission items to get your approval and get your direction on, and some of those have become standing items. So really what you're dealing with is in some ways legacies of previous decisions by former commissioners and by former leaders of the department, as well as things that have been obviously mandated by the legislature. On that last point, I would flag that there are a number of things that obviously are within your purview that cannot be delegated. There are legislatively mandated items that you must take action on and that you own as a commission, such as the approval of the appointment of the state engineer, or for that matter, the selection of the director, as you mentioned previously in the meeting, Chairman Brocklin. There are also legislatively mandated processes that are within your purview that cannot be delegated. Thinking here of certain land use appeals and the like. There are also things that the department just simply doesn't have the authority to act on, like establishing a director's bond. That said, those categories aside, there are a number of things that are within your purview to delegate or to retain ownership of, and that's really what we're talking about here. The other point I'd flag, just for everyone's awareness, is when there are overlapping authorities between the Commission and the Department, obviously the Commission assumes authority on those. So just to round out the background here, though, and why we're having this conversation is really to ensure that, as was mentioned earlier in the meeting, that the Commission and you all, we have heard loud and clear from many of you, from most of you, a desire to make sure that y'all are operating in the space you want to most operate in providing the vision and the strategic direction for the department, and leaving the kind of project-related details and some of the details and decisions that are probably most suitably made by the subject matter experts within the department to those subject matter experts or the leaders within the department, and ensuring that you have the time and the bandwidth to really steer the department as has been directed by the legislature and the governor that you all do. And so that's really the impetus behind even having this conversation, is hearing those comments from you all and recognizing that there are some legacy items that are perhaps misaligned with where you are as individual commissioners and where the whole of the commission is, and certainly where we are as a department as well. So I will jump to the next slide, slide 3, and I'll provide you a couple examples of the types of delegations that we're talking about. And Mr. Lind will get into a more specific after this agenda item, which you guys can delve into. But we're talking about here such items as right-of-way acquisitions. We're talking about approvals of jurisdictional transfers. We're talking about some of the processes that come before you in terms of transportation plan amendments, for instance. Some of the safety items, transportation safety plan, an annual review of approval is another one that comes before you. So our goal as the department, and if you can, please go to the next slide, is to collect some of these delegations as just mentioned and given examples of, roll them up into a list of recommendations, which we bring back before you, we're hoping to bring in May, to start talking through each of these delegations individually and get your thoughts on them. The thinking is that we would have a pretty comprehensive list that laid out the delegations, obviously a little bit of background on what we're talking about, the type of authority, obviously that is being associated with the delegation, and then what's there in statute or otherwise in terms of can these things be delegated, how, a little bit of history, and also we'll incorporate in there any DOJ comments. We'll make sure that these are vetted through DOJ before they come to you as recommendations. So the thinking is we would come back in May with a list of these to begin this discussion with you all. And in this discussion, I think some of the questions we would ask would be, do you want these delegations to be made to the department? And if not, and you want them to come back to the commission, do you want them to come back as regular agenda items? Do you want to provide some guidance on, yes, we want this item to come back, but we want it to always be a consent calendar item, that type of thing. The other key kind of element in this conversation, as I see it, is that I look at this process, and I think we collectively as the leaders of the department look at this process. The analogy I'd use is it's kind of like tuning up your car. You have to periodically take your car in. We don't have to. It serves you well to take your car in and get it tuned up to make sure that that everything's aligned. And so this discussion is really, I see it as a living discussion, something that needs to be revisited on a somewhat regular basis by the commission. I would certainly recommend annually, at least when you have the work plan conversation, but really more frequently as needed with changes in the context in which ODOT's operating, changes within leadership within the department, changes within leadership of commissioners and commissioners being on the OTC. All of those things I think would warrant relooks. And so recommendation is that this be a recurring conversation that comes back to you. So in light of that, bringing this before you in May, let me back up. The intent was to have this conversation, Vice Chair Simpson, to your point in your question about the previous agenda item. I can envision you maybe asking, why don't we have this conversation after we get together for the workshop, and after we make sure that we're aligned and have set those priorities, agency priorities and goals, and that those are consistent with your values and your direction. The intent was certainly to have that as part of the conversation at the workshop. Obviously, as has been mentioned, the workshop has been unfortunately bumped for a number of circumstances beyond October when it was originally scheduled. And so there is a realization that if this is going to be a living conversation, why not start it now? Why not bring before you in the near term, since we don't have full clarity on exactly when that workshop will happen, the list of potential delegations for you all to start to digest. So that was the thinking of why we would bring it in May. But there's recognition that some elements will probably need to be revisited after you all do come together and have that workshop, whenever that may be in the near future. So if you can, please go to slide 5. And this really lays out the questions that we're seeking guidance on from you, and they're pretty general. First and foremost, does this plan work? Is this something that you want to revisit? And if so, is this something you want to revisit in May? And then subsequent to that, what types of delegations do you want to retain or gain for that matter? What are those that most interest you and that you feel strongly should be key oversight functions of the department that you have brought before you on a regular basis? What types do you think are relevant and should be delegated to the department? The other thing I would flag is there's also, at least in cases, and we'll have to go back and ensure that this is consistent with law, but there are cases where you could designate individual commissioners to be the approval authority of certain decisions based on their experience, their background, et cetera. And then the final question is really any other direction that you'd like to give us and steer us so we can make sure that we're meeting your intent and having a conversation that you want to have and you think is relevant. So with that, I will pause for questions, comments, and happy to answer anything that you'd like to ask.
Questions or comments by, maybe we should start with questions. Are there questions of Cooper? Okay, then let's go to comments. Commissioner comments on the plan, which, as I understand, would be to begin the conversation about provisions of delegations in May and have that go on for a little while. If we had a workshop in July, maybe not complete this review process until after that workshop, then maybe bring back something for approval in August, something like that, or September, some kind of time frame like that.
Mr. Chair, we can certainly, while that is certainly something we can do, I think there's also the possibility of just making, having this as a topic that is revisited and having individual decisions on those specific recommendations in terms of delegations on a case-by-case basis as you all feel comfortable. So, for instance, the next agenda item will be one example of the types of delegations we're talking about. So it's entirely your call whether you'd like to make approvals after the full conversation or whether you'd like to do them individually as they come up.
Yeah, I'm fine with either way, actually, but I see the advantage of doing them as they come up and become topical or rise to the top. I also would want to do it in a way that we are recognizing the conversation we're going to have at the workshop and the outcome of that. But as you say, I think the most important point here is this is a living conversation, and we will make changes and fine-tune it as we go along. So this is a continuing conversation about what belongs where. As long as we all approach it that way and are recognize we're trying to fine-tune it to get to the right balance and get to the right level of delegation and delegation in the right areas. I think that it's fine to do it as we're going to do the next item as kind of one-offs or do them onesies and twosies, as long as we get, if there's some coherency at the end of what we're trying to get done, and then we're just fine-tuning along the way. I do think we need a discussion about what our general philosophical view is of how much we delegate and how much we retain. But I would like to hear from the commissioners on this if they have initial thoughts on your questions on page 5. Is this a good approach?
This is Commissioner Calorie. I like the idea of Director Brown or Assistant Director Brown's laundry list, I'll call it, of potential delegations or whatever we're legally mandated to do. I think if that was in a kind of a check-off box type of thing, then we could go item by item. And even if we do it in May, it gives us some impetus to further discuss it at the workshop.
Other thoughts? Thank you, Commissioner.
Sharon Smith here. I agree generally with the plan and weighing in on the types of delegations that I would want to retain. I think my perspective is I don't think we should be in the business of micromanaging the operations of the department, and I think the STIP amendment delegation is a good example. I don't think we're the best qualified to decide whether a $500,000 change is needed in the field. I mean, that should be left to the people who are doing the decision-making, the work, and that if it has to come to the commission, then it becomes a delay in our process, which I don't think serves the public well. So to me, we should be doing oversight on strategic and generative topics, not operational topics.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think the other point I would make, just to piggyback on what Commissioner Smith just said, is I think we have to make room in our schedule at these meetings to do that strategic work and that oversight work. And if we're dealing with too much, I'm not going to call it minutia because $500,000 is not minutia, but dealing with, if we get too far down in the operational segment, I agree with the expertise point. We're not as qualified as we'd like to be to make those decisions, although on occasion we'll have to. But also, in addition to the time thing, that it just pushes out discussions on the things that ought to be the highest priorities to be in front of the commission. And so I think we've got to set some, as I hope we do in this next item, that recognize the more of this kind of thing that we put on our plate, the less time we have to talk about how to implement environmental policies, what we're doing on funding. And we're spending a lot more time, candidly, talking about STIP amendments and things like that than talking about funding, and not as much as when I first came on, which it was, and I recognize that was right after House Bill 2017 was approved, and there was a lot of implementation that first year. But I do think we want to get to the place where we're really talking about the things where we're adding maximum value to the operation, and the delay point is a really good one. I mean, as I have learned on some of our mega projects, every month we're not moving forward is expensive. Delay is expensive. And it's, we need to be stewards of the public purse here. So we can't, delay is not fiscally prudent. So other commissioners, comments?
I agree. I think it's sufficient. I'm absolutely second Sharon's comments and not wanting to micromanage really minute items. I'm very confident in our new director and our initial iteration in terms of direction we want to go. So I think keeping it more visionary, higher level is going to be, I think, the best use of the commission's time, and furthermore, even other commissioners that come on board over the next several years as this commission turns out.
Commissioner Brown? Thank you, Commissioner Simpson.
I'm in agreement. I think as a policy body, we sometimes get pushed to getting in the weeds of operations, and I'd like to see us back away from it as much as possible. So I agree that I think we need to look at this in May and really question what we're doing.
And Assistant Director Brown, maybe the way that discussion could go, it's kind of along the lines of several of these comments, is we could get a list. There may be a whole bunch of them we can just decide in May. There may be a few that we want to wait until we've had our strategic discussion before we decide. But we can start sorting out what we can act on immediately and what we might want to spend a little more time thinking about in the context of a broader conversation about vision and strategic direction.
I agree, and I think that some of the things that we've been delegated to do, maybe we can back off.
Roger that.
Okay.
Yeah, you bet, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brown. We can certainly do that, and we'll structure it as such when we bring back a list of potential recommendations in May.
And thanks, Commissioner Callery, for that idea. That's a good one. if we get something in front of us, I think we can sort through fairly quickly the yeses and the nos, and then we'll probably have a subgroup with a smaller list that is, we're going to spend a little bit more time on these. So let's leave them where they are right now while we think about them, and, you know, in the coming few months, we'll sort through those too. I don't know how long that short list is, but, you know, hopefully it's reasonably short. Okay. So, we ready to move to the next item? Assistant Director Brown, do you have any further comment on this item we're just on now? Delegations generally, or can we move to this decision item on the STIP delegation?
Mr. Chair, I'm certainly comfortable and appreciative of the direction you all provided. I think that certainly meets our need. So we'll come back to this topic in May. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Thanks to the Commission for its thoughtful input, and we will proceed as we described in this meeting. But let's move to the to item D2, and Deputy Division Administrator Mac Lind will present on that. Mr. Lind?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. Mac Lind, Deputy Administrator for Delivery and Operations. Thanks for allowing me some time to talk about this. You very much started to get into this topic in the last agenda item and Assistant Director Brown's comments. We did that on purpose, nesting these two together because there is such overlap. And this is the first of several conversations you'll be having over the coming months, as you just discussed, around the delegations of what remains at the Commission level and what remains within the agency. So before I move off of the first slide, I just want to reset what we're discussing here, and likely the commissioners understand that, but for the public's interest, I thought I'd just take a couple seconds here and provide some context. So we have a 4-year STIP document that is our projects, our programming of federal funds, both for ODOT, local agencies, some federal entities, our MPO partners, as well as our transit entities. So there's a quite extensive grouping of projects and funds allocated through that STIP program. It's a 4-year document. We generally update it every 3 years. In the last STIP, the 2018 through 2021 STIP, there was about 1,300 individual projects identified in that document. About 2/3 of those were ODOT and about 1/3 were other entities. It's a fiscally constrained document, meaning when we have project savings, we reinvest those project savings into something else. When we have costs that come in higher, we have to go augment that STIP to capture those increased costs. So it's a living document that we are constantly amending, which is where the term STIP amendment comes from. Some of those are pretty benign in nature. Maybe it's an error in the name of a project or an error when we entered something. Those are fairly benign and administrative, and then they get more complex. Potentially we have significant impacts to a project that weren't identified during the scoping and programming of a project. Maybe political will within a local community has changed, or the economy has changed dramatically, which has forced changes to our costs for those projects. So there's a whole host of reasons why we might want to or need to amend a STIP. So with that, I'll jump to the next slide, slide number 2. Background and history. The last time the Commission took action on this was in June 2017, right before the passage and approval of House Bill 2017. And at that time, the Commission had a lot of discussion around what was the appropriate or right threshold given where the agency was at in project delivery, where the agency was at in managing the portfolio, and what role the Commission wanted to have and overseeing some of the actions of the agency. And that decision at the time was made that anything greater than $500,000 of change, generally speaking, would require OTC action. That was a bit of a conservative approach compared to maybe where we had been previously to that point, but that was the operating practice we've been under since that time. In 2019, there was an internal ODOT audit led by Ms. Hartinger's Audit Services Group, looking at the STIP amendment process. And in particular, they identified a number of things that the department could improve upon around their project delivery, scoping, programming, and overall process that has led or did lead at that time to a significant amount of STIP amendments. And to the chair's comments on the last agenda item, the commission was being asked to approve and consider a number of the STIP amendments each month at their commission meeting. One, because of those challenges with our process and practices, and two, because of that fairly low threshold, if you will. At this last year, we also led a significant effort to make some project delivery improvement efforts. So Director Strickler, in his former role as the Highway Division Administrator, and myself certainly led a conversation with the Commission early in 2019 around some significant improvements that the department took on around our scoping practices, our scheduling of projects, just our overall portfolio management. And one in particular was our cost estimating approach. And we certainly talked about that before with the Commission. Just a complete shift in how we're approaching how we estimate projects and do a much better job than maybe we historically had done. So a lot of effort got initiated early last year and has been implemented to date. Those efforts led to, as all of you are familiar with, our significant STIP rebalance in June 2019. So we've dramatically reset the table of our current STIP, the cost estimates, the expectations for delivery, taking into account our new cost estimating approach, and just our overall project delivery approach. Really a monumental moment in resetting our expectations for how we move forward. And I will provide a little color commentary. The STIP amendment audit certainly raised the question of how many amendments we were doing each month. It was quite high. The STIP rebalance took a tremendous amount of those all on at one time. And I'm happy to report that our track record since last summer has shown that we have dramatically changed the curve. I think the Commission has felt that with only a handful, if not one or two, STIP amendments coming forward to the Commission each month. But the ones you're not seeing, maybe those lower dollar thresholds or those more administrative ones, have also decreased substantially down to sometimes we were as high as 80 to 100 amendments in a month. And I'm happy to report in the last 6 months, we've been as low as 10 or 14 a month. So just a substantial change in the way we're approaching our business. So that's a bit of the background and history on where this conversation has been, what kind of operating practices we've been under. And as I flip to the next slide, slide number 3, I want to talk about what changes we're recommending to the Commission. And I would first start with trust. We've been spending a ton of time working on our processes and procedures to really increase the trust of the public and the trust of the Commission that we can be held responsible for delivering and executing our portfolio of projects to a much higher confidence level than maybe what we have done in the past. So I appreciate the moment we're at today to be able to talk about this, and it's not lost on me, leadership within the department, or our professionals that deliver these projects, that this is a moment of trust. As we move forward, I just would like to set maybe some context. There's no secret to what threshold we set. It's really the Commission's direction. Other states nationally are across the board in terms of how they approach this. the STIP amendment audit identified that we're pretty low at $500,000 nationally. Other states are certainly higher than that. Some are at $1 million to $2 million. There are several that are at $5 million. So just give you 2 or 3 examples. Idaho is at $2 million. So anything above $2 million requires their commission approval. Washington, I believe, is at $3 million, and Colorado is at $5 million. So it really runs the board across the nation just based on the commissions that they have. Some don't have commissions, as well as just their relationship and expectations within the agency. So I wanted to provide a little of that context for you as we move forward with this recommendation. Last thing I'd mention is just in this moment of COVID and the impacts we're starting to see, we're also planning or anticipating a significant amount of change to our STIP, not only because of the financial and economic impacts that we're still just now starting to learn and anticipate what that might look like, and it's still changing, in addition to what costs our contractors and consultants are experiencing on the ground. So certainly we're experiencing some project delays as contractors can't assemble the workforce to show up because of challenges, or maybe they can't move in from their home location in another state, just given concerns over travel and social distancing. And so we're just now starting to see some of those, and we anticipate more coming in. So as we put forth a recommendation to increase the threshold, that will afford us the flexibility and the nimbleness to take those actions without having to, as Commissioner Smith brought up and others on the last agenda item, not add delay in making an important and decisive decision to keep projects moving forward. So the recommendation we put forth, informed a bit by obviously agency conversation, but also from comments from some of you individual commissioners as well, is to delegate more to the agency. We certainly know that at the discretion of both Director Strickler and really any of the commission members, we can bring any item to the commission for discussion or action, regardless of how big or small the change may be. But the overall kind of change would be increasing that threshold, generally speaking, if you will, to anything above $5 million would be coming to the commission for deliberation and decision making. Below that threshold, we would keep that. The recommendation would be we'd keep that decision within the agency, either at the director level or at the division administrator level, specifically for delivery and operations. In my role, as well as Ms. Rowe steps into that role on Monday, what decision authority can we retain within the agency to manage those actions? So that's the recommendation we're bringing forward. And with that, I'll pause for any questions or comments.
Questions for Mr. Lenz? Okay. Comments by the commission?
Well, I guess this is Sharon. Maybe it's kind of a combination question, comment. I'm comfortable. I think the department has come a long way in project delivery, and I'm mindful of the need to be able to react quickly when circumstances change. Would it be an undue burden to maybe ask for just a report as part of the consent agenda, maybe even quarterly, on, you know, the certain threshold of amendments, so that we just keep an eye on things? And is that something that you would be putting together anyway? I don't want to add administrative burden.
Yeah, Commissioner Smith, Chairman Brockline, I appreciate that question, and I apologize for not mentioning that. That's certainly what we've been talking about internally. Regardless of the commission's threshold, we know that we want to manage our performance and hold ourselves accountable to that level of performance and expectation that not only you are setting, but we as leaders are setting. And in fact, I'm looking at a draft presentation right now, capturing the data, the reasons that we are amending projects, and how does that inform what continuous improvement efforts we're continuing to take on to always strive to do better. So yes, I think it's really whatever the commission would be interested in seeing. We're certainly going to be doing that, some level of performance management, regardless of what you may be asking for, just to hold ourselves accountable and also inform all of our project managers and our staff that are out doing the great work that we do to deliver projects. How are we keeping them informed on our progress as well? So yes, we can easily do that, and I think I'd probably suggest, if that would be okay, we put together a draft of that over the next couple months and bring that forward to the commission as an opportunity to see if that meets the expectation you would have to have some level of assurance that we are managing this and not sliding backwards, which is certainly not the expectation. In fact, we'll be driving harder given this change to increase our performance.
Sharon speaking. Yes, I think that's a great suggestion.
So, Commissioner Smith, would you want that on the consent agenda for approval, or would it be an informational document?
I guess I'm looking to the department to make a recommendation. I mean, it could just be informational.
Maybe if we could have it prior to the meetings quarterly, you tell us, Mr. Lynn, but if we could maybe have a quarterly report, which I think was the kind of thing that Commissioner Smith was suggesting that we could get in advance of, say the last meeting of the quarter, so March, and then again in moving through the year from there, every quarter. In the last month of each quarter, get a report that we could get in advance, a short report, because I agree with Commissioner Smith, we don't want to add a lot of administrative burden here. If we had questions, we could just have a quarterly item that was 15 minutes or something, where if we had questions, we could ask them on the agenda. If we didn't, then we would just be informational, but if there was something we wanted to ask, we could ask it. Just so we're this is the oversight function, I think, that Commissioner Smith is really getting to, and I do think we have some oversight responsibility.
Yeah, Chair Van Brockland, I appreciate that comment, absolutely, and we'll work up what that might look like and bring that back maybe at a pre-meeting, at a future meeting, to just see if that works for you all, and then we can launch into an informational item or quarterly report. I know Director Strickler and I have also talked about how are we keeping you informed, not only on our performance, but also what we're seeing from industry in the economy in general around our bidding climate, what kind of costs we're seeing, et cetera. So absolutely, we'll put together something and bring that forward to you shortly.
So if we could see that at the May meeting, then we could start this end of quarter actual report the following month in June. That might be a good schedule.
Yeah, Chair Van Brockland, absolutely. We'll get on that, and I think we can even add a slide to the existing quarterly report, but probably have a little bit of daylighting this with you in May. So thank you for that.
And if you just distribute it around, great. And if you just distribute that around in advance of the May meeting, we'll have an opportunity to look at it, and we can spend a few minutes in the pre-meeting talking about it, just to see if we're getting what we need. Okay, are there other comments
Yeah.
on this item? If not, I guess I would take a motion for approval of the recommendation with maybe with Commissioner Smith, so she can add this report piece.
Sure. I move approval. Let me get to the right place. Of revised delegations for the statewide transportation improvement program amendments and contract authorizations with a quarterly report to the commission on the high-level summary of the STIP amendments to date.
Okay, and this would encompass 5.3's provisions about discretion of the director to bring something that was under the $5 million threshold, or commissioners, if they so choose. That's part of what they're proposing here. But otherwise, it would be a $5 million threshold. Is that
yes,
correct?
I would take that as a friendly amendment.
Okay, great. Is there a second to to Commissioner Smith's motion with the friendly amendment?
This is Commissioner Calorie. I second.
Seconded by Commissioner Calorie. Is there further discussion? If not, I'm going to take a roll call vote. Vice Chair Simpson.
Aye.
Commissioner Calorie.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Recommendation approved. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Lind. Good presentation. And we look forward to seeing that mock-up of the report in May.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Director Strickler. Thank you. Director Strickler, item E.
Perfect. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, this is Chris Strickler once again. Before we roll into item E, I just wanted to say two quick follow-up notes to the decision you just made. One is just a reminder for all involved that anything that you deem appropriate to bring forward for discussion, we will certainly comply. We want to make all of our work available to you and all of the actions available to you to the extent that you have time and interest in bringing something forward. We will certainly accommodate that. And then the other is I recognize and we recognize through the organization the trust, but even more importantly, the accountability that comes with this decision. We take that very seriously. We'll continue to take that seriously, and we will ensure that we bring all of this information forward to you, including that quarterly update, so that you can see the progress that we've made. So thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair, with that, you bet. At this point, I'd like to request consideration of the consent agenda items. And I understand, Mr. Chair, that you may have potential conflicts with a right-of-way portion, which is consent item 3.
Yes, I have I want to declare a potential conflict of interest with respect to the right-of-way resolution, item 3 of the consent agenda. My law firm represents clients, entities that are identified in the right-of-way resolution as being technically adverse to ODOT, legally adverse as an ethical matter, and therefore, in an abundance of caution, even though I'm not sure that some of the actual conflicts, I'm going to declare them as potential conflicts and recuse myself from voting or deliberating on item 3 of the consent agenda. I will preside over the disposition of it by the commission, but I'm not going to participate in the deliberation of item 3 or vote.
Okay, so given the potential, can we pull forward consent item 3, and I look for a motion from member of the commission on consent agenda item 3?
Is there such a motion? on item 3?
This is Commissioner Calorie. I move for approval I'm not quite sure what I'm moving for approval of.
Consent calendar item 3.
Okay. I move for approval of consent item 3.
And so moved. Is there a second to Commissioner Calorie's motion?
Commissioner Simpson, I second the motion.
Vice Chair Simpson seconds the motion. Discussion on the motion. Hearing none, all those in favor, and I will go in a roll call vote. Vice Chair Simpson.
Aye.
Commissioner Calorie.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith votes aye. The chair abstains. The motion passes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So at this point then, I would ask for a motion on the remaining consent agenda items in block, those being consent agenda items 1, 2, and 4 through 14.
Is there a motion?
Commissioner Calorie, yes. I move for approval as stated by Director Strickler.
It's been moved that we approve items 1, 2, and 4 through 14 of the consent calendar. Is there a second?
Commissioner Simpson seconds the motion.
Vice Chair Simpson seconds the motion. Discussion? Hearing none, we will vote in a roll call vote, yea or nay. Vice Chair Simpson.
Yea.
Commissioner Calorie.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Yay.
Commissioner Smith.
Yay.
Chair votes aye as well. Motion passes. I believe that concludes our scheduled agenda items. Is there any other matter to come before by the commissioners or the director to come before the commission? Hearing none, thank you all very much for your attending and for participating under these somewhat limited situations or circumstances, given the fact we're having to do this over the phone. I appreciate it. I suspect we will be back on the phone in May, but hopefully we will be in person soon thereafter. So with that, I want to thank all of you who attended and listened to our meeting today. Thank you very much for your continuing participation. And with that, we are